want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Kent Bai, and I do the Voices of VR podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about experiential design and world building, and talking a little bit about using some VRChat worlds. So just a little context as to who I am. So back in 2014, I started the Voices of VR podcast. And so since then, I've done around 1,600 interviews with people in the VR community and published. I'm coming up here on episode 1,000, and I've been in probably 3,000 to 4,000 different worlds. And so I spent a lot of time going to different events, probably around 100 events or so over the last 7 years, seeing different experiences and really, covering the entire VR industry. And so, did a bunch of interviews with people. So this is me in 2014 when I started the Voices of VR podcast at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Conference, which this is what actually VRChat looked like back in 2014. Very simple. In fact, some of the very early versions of VRChat had just, automatic T-poses with folks. But I had a chance to do some interviews with both the founders and creators of VRChat and employees each year for the last, for the first 6 years of my podcast. And so every year I'd be, talking with Jesse Jodry or Graham Yailer or Ron Miller or other employees and just kind of getting some periodic check-ins. VRChat doesn't actually do a lot of interviews anymore, so it's kind of interesting to look at these early histories of interviews with some of the founders and creators. Recently, last year in 2000 and... Oh, hold on one second. Let me just start something. Okay. So at the Rain Dance, I was asked to be one of the jurors for the immersive worlds. And so I was going through different worlds and being a judge and sort of trying to figure out what were the worlds that, we should be honoring at Rain Dance. And I've been on juries for other events as well, like Laval Virtual, and there was a Geneva International Film Festival. So I end up going to a lot of film festivals like Sundance and South by Southwest and Venice Film Festival and Tribeca, and I end up seeing a lot of these immersive storytelling experiences. And I think, what ends up happening is you go to these different experiences, you see these experiences that are at these worlds, and then you kind of calibrate what is interesting, what is things that are new or different. And so since I've been doing that, then I'm going to be kind of sharing today kind of some information around just experiential design. So this is just a little bit of a history from 2015. Some flyers that they were giving out for VRChat. So for giving a free VRChat avatar, you could get one of these flyers and you can redeem your code. And there's also create your own VRChat world was also something that I wanted to put this in there just because I was going through my old papers, but also VRChat and VRChat in general has been very much into creating your avatars and doing your own world building and user-generated content literally from the very beginning of when they created their software program. But today, overall, I'm going to be covering these two main sections. The first section is going into 4 dimensions of experience of quality, context, character, and story. And then we'll be talking a little bit about how to fuse together all these different design disciplines. So before I dive into each of these different lenses that you can look into, I think it's important just to say that you are creators here within VRChat, and you have your own intuitive process for how you make worlds. And I'd say, continue to cultivate your own process by doing that. But I think this, as a sort of a theoretical lens, could be a way to help reflect on your process or some of the different trade-offs that you have to make as you're building worlds. And I think that's the language, part of what I've been learning over the last 7 years of doing a lot of these different interviews with creators is that a lot of this is finding the language to be able to talk about these different experiences and try to talk about the subtle nuances of your own phenomenological experiences. And so it's through that process that I've been trying to come up with some language to, talk about these different dimensions and different trade-offs that people have to make within their experiences. As a world builder, you have to you're putting in a bunch of ingredients and you're trying to cultivate someone's phenomenological experience. And because of that, there's some things that you do that are going to take away from other aspects of the experience. And so each of these 4 different sections, I'd say, are equivalence classes, where there's things that are inherently in tension with each other, where sometimes they're all happening at the same time and sometimes they're mutually exclusive. So as that's sort of setting the context, and we'll be diving into 4 of these different lenses. This is just 4. There could be kind of an infinite amount of those lenses, but this is what I've kind of settled on. So, okay, let's go into the first lens, which is in the quality of the experience. So you have different qualities of presence when you have different experiences. You have active presence, the degree to which that you're expressing your will and, having different gameplay mechanics. So that's sort of like the video games. You have mental and social presence. So all the different levels of abstraction of language that either come through interacting with other people, or there may be a puzzle that you have to have a certain amount of mental friction to be able to solve. And then there's emotional presence, which is a lot of ways of building and releasing tension, of telling a story. And music does this in a lot of ways of kind of building up and releasing. But a lot of the narratives that end up being a little bit more passive or try to really cultivate a certain emotion. And then there's the embodied and environmental presence. That's the degree that you feel like you're embodied within an avatar, an identity, but also the world that you're in, that it makes you feel like you're in a place. And so I'll be going through each of these, active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and environmental and embodied presence. So if you look at the existing communications medium, you have the video games, which is a lot of the active presence. It's a lot about the different gameplay mechanics that you have within an experience, the ways that you express your agency or see traces of your agency within an experience. You have the mental and social presence. And so there's a lot of user interface design and human-computer interaction and web design and narrative design and mobile phone design and ways that you're kind of interacting and communicating with your friends. And then a lot of website design. So that's both the active presence and mental social presence. And then you have the like sort of cinematic storytelling and emotional presence. That film has a lot of that aspect of, when you watch a film, it's really, you don't have any ability for you to express your will and to change the story. So you're just really passively receiving a story that someone is trying to tell you. Music is another good example of that, as well as like other subtle things like lighting is able to set a mood, and color is able to set a tone and a mood as well. And then the thing that's new with virtual reality is this ability to really make you feel like you're in a place and you're surrounded in that world. And it's that sense of embodiment and hijacking all of your sensory experiences and really transporting you. But there's other media such as architecture or theater or dance that are also very embodied. And so I think the important thing to note here is that virtual reality is tying together all of these different existing design disciplines: game design, human-computer interaction, cinematic storytelling, and these new affordances of embodiment and environmental design and architecture. And so the thing is like it's a sense of presence under each of these, and some of these, all 4 of these things are all happening all at the same time, but sometimes there's different trade-offs. So let's sort of dig in here a little bit more. So you can think about the active presence as taking action, the mental and social presence as making choices, and then the degree to which that you feel like you're emotionally immersed within the world, and then having a direct haptic and sensory experience within that world. So these are roughly correlated to the different elements of earth, air, fire, and water. The fire and air elements are the elements that have more active energy, and you can think of that as energy going outward. That's the hot. So Aristotle talked about these polarities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. So the energy going outward is the more fire and air, and then the more receptive, passive elements are the earth and water. So you can see that the hot, cold, wet, and dry, these are 2 dialectics. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that you never have a complete extreme. It's always some sort of combination of these 2, and they're usually in flux of going from one to another. And I think that's a big thing about experiential design, is the process of creating contrasts amongst these axes of what are in some sense mutually exclusive, where you can't have one extreme or another, but they're in more of a spectrum. We can have multiple axes. And there's lots of different ways you could start to put things onto these axes. But I think in terms of like a baseline of the quality of presence, this sort of, these elements I've found to be very helpful in looking at a lot of these different experiences. So again, energy in which you're giving energy outward versus degree which you're receiving inward. And then the wet and dry are sort of on one end individuating and the other end bonding. So you're kind of connecting to other people, and the other end you're kind of like on your own. All right. So again, this is the four elements that are all the different sort of communication media. And I think we're going to go through some examples. Well, first, before I dive into some VRChat world examples, there's a talk that I gave on the immersive architecture of Half-Life Alyx. And if you go through Half-Life Alyx, even through one stage of one world, you have different rooms. And Half-Life Alyx is very much based on the room to room. So depending on what room you're in, it has a different focus. And so as you go through each of these different worlds, then you can see that there's a different balance. Some worlds are about you going around and collecting the objects, which is, I'd say, a lot of the earth element of trying to sort of gather your resources in this kind of collecting and gathering aspect, or just looking at the world and world design. Some of the worlds are much more about solving puzzles. Some there's a combat and different gameplay mechanics. And some have little cutscenes and different aspects of the story and narrative that is being revealed to you. And I think, and all the different experiences, all four of these elements are all happening at the same time, but there's center of gravity where you're kind of focusing on one and then also kind of jumping in between each of these. And Half-Life Alyx is a good example to see that, because I think if anything, it's such a strong experience because it does balance each of these quite well. And you can go through each of the different stages and see, like, some of the stages are much more about the story and the cinematic story, trying to communicate different aspects of the unfolding story. Some are more about the combat, some are more about puzzles that you're solving, and some more just about you enjoying the environment or collecting and gathering things. Okay, so I'm going to go through some examples of VRChat worlds here and kind of break down different aspects. And I think, like I said, most of these, all of these worlds have all these different aspects of presence all happening at the same time. But in some sense, there could be like a center of gravity where it's stronger in some. And so I'll be going through some of these different examples. And so, okay, let's see here. All right, so the first is the Hook Junkers by Blue Aces and Phase Dragon, where it's a lot about, you're actively moving and locomoting through the space in that sense of active presence. It also has a strong amount of embodied presence because the actions are so much in your body. And so it's a really good combination of both the embodied presence as you're moving around, but also the active presence of sort of this mechanic that is just inherently fun to do, to kind of like swing around and you're just, feel like Spider-Man as you're going around these worlds. And then you have the Putt-Putt Bond by Ostinho. And this is just a game, a place where it's like you're playing putt-putt golf. And this actually ends up being a lot of social presence as well, because it's a very social game to go play with other people. But it's a very satisfying gameplay mechanic to be able to play the putt-putt golf, which I think actually does a really great job of like recreating that feeling of playing putt-putt. Okay, then you have the Kitchen Cooks by Jar. So this is an experience where it is a social game, but it's also like it's very embodied, but there are some gameplay mechanics of having to actually put all these different objects together. And it reminds me of a lot of the job simulator-esque type of aspect of, this game where it's very embodied and trying to, in some sense, combine these different objects. And as you combine them, then you have different unique things that happen through those combinations. So that's the active presence. Let's move on to some examples of the embodied and environmental presence, just to give you a sense. So this is the Spire by Kier, where you're climbing again. This whole climbing interaction. It's a mechanic that is in some sense active presence, but it's also it makes you feel like you're actually climbing in your body. And so I'd say it's a very embodied world as you go through it. Then there's this is the Syntax Error by Miss Stabby, which I just put this in as generally people who do full body tracking to be able to do dancing and feel like they're in a world and you feel like you have this sense of actually being at a dance club. And so that sense of embodied presence, I'd say, in that sort of whole underground dance scene that's happening in VRChat is really emphasizing this sense of embodied presence. And then you have the MMD Dance World by Maki, which in some sense, I think I put this in here just because you have the mirrors, and anytime you have a mirror, you're able to see a representation of yourself, and that's the what Mel Slater says the virtual body ownership illusion. That's the degree to which that you see a synchrony of your body moving, and when you see a synchrony of your body moving, then you feel more embodied in your avatar. I think that's a big reason why you see a lot of mirrors and why mirrors are everywhere in VRChat, because it's very much about your avatar representation of your identity. And in this case, you are allowing someone else to kind of take control of that embodiment, and they're, you see yourself dancing, and you have this sort of interesting experience of, I kind of feel like you're dancing even though you're not dancing. And so you have this virtual body ownership illusion that then is being taken over and making it feel like you're doing something that you're actually not. But I think just in general, the mirrors, I think it's a big part of making you feel like you're much more embodied within your avatar representation. Okay, so then you have the A Shelter in Place by Dirk at Work, which, this is an amazing world, and this is a good example of just being in a place where it just is spectacular, and feels just real transportive to me in a world like this. And so I think some of the worlds are much more about you just being in a place and trying to make you feel grounded in that place. And that is the main purpose of some of these worlds, is just to kind of feel like you're being transported to another world. So then this is a photogrammetry called Hall Wild Museum by Tiger Chips, and this is a place where, it's literally just trying to capture a volumetric capture of the space, and it's all about trying to give you this sense of environmental presence of a place that, I've never been to this museum, but I've kind of walked around, and I imagine if I actually went there, I would have like this memory of being in that place, even though I haven't actually been there. And so there's a power of creating these embodied memories of places that you can start to do with, specific techniques like photogrammetry. And there's another one here, which is the Venice tour by Nobel Choco, which was at the Virtual Market 5. And again, this was an interesting one because it actually, you're on a boat, and the boat is actually not moving, but all of the photogrammetry scenes around you are moving, and it actually gives you even more of a sense of being in a place when you have this ability to kind of locomote through that world, and you have this kind of mental map of in your mind that is being created by as you go to places, you kind of encode a spatial memory. And I think so doing stuff like that can actually bring this real deep sense of environmental presence. And the final one here of this section is The Land of Spirits by Keir. And I put this one in here just because there is a lot of this locomotion through this space, and it ends up being a lot of the architectural, aspects. And I think the virtual market does this as well, as you go through these different worlds where you kind of feel like you're in this place by walking around and, feeling like you're actually being transported to a place that has a lot of character. All right, so mental and social presence. Moving on to the next section here. So VRChat is a social VR. So obviously there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the VR aspects of the social VR. So you have the Among Us by Jar, which, obviously Among Us was a social game, but then, having a lot of these different translations, but and it ends up being like trying to reveal certain aspects of your character, or you're trying to hide or to lie in some sense, or to detect who might be deceiving you. So it ends up being just a really good affordance in terms of using what's interesting or fun about social VR. All these little subtle nuances of body language and everything else as you're communicating. And then you have the Wavelength, which is another one, which is a guessing game. But again, you have this ability to start to learn about people by, having these different questions and answers. And it ends up being a way to just connect to other people and just kind of in a fun way. And then you have a couple of campfire scenes. One is from the Kazahana Peak, which is a world that was commissioned by Brunswick, developed by Legends for Smeed, and then the XR Social Club by Immersivist. So these are just, campfire scenes in general naturally have ways that people want to gather around the campfire and to be able to just talk to each other. And I've noticed that whenever you have these campfires, that it does end up being a place that people want to have a circle around and have a way to connect to each other. So both in the XR Social Club and the Kazahana Peaks, or Kazahana Peak, they have these different places to be able to have that. And so, again, this is just a strength for trying to emphasize the social presence. Now, in terms of the mental, social and mental presence, so the mental presence has a lot of these different puzzle aspects. So this is the Crypt of the Spirits by Akalink. Again, so this is a very embodied puzzle where you're moving around and you have to, take these light beams and have them reflect around in order to hit a certain spot. And so, these different worlds that have this combination of embodiment and spatialization, but also, you're trying to solve these puzzles as you're going through each of these different worlds. And then, of course, the Devouring, which is by the Four Ponies of Yakuza and Sign Laser and Fiona and Legends, where there's a lot of different puzzle aspects within this game where you're trying to find different objects. I mean, there's a lot of different. Actually, this is an example where I think the devouring is actually hitting a lot of the different aspects of all the different qualities of presence that make it such a strong experience. But probably one of the stronger ones is the puzzle aspects, but also there's quite a lot of embodied. As you're going through this space, a real strong environmental design. You have the music is amazing, which gives you this deep sense of emotional presence, and trying to build up these aspects of the tension. And there's a lot of really interesting gameplay mechanics of all the different monsters. And if I think there's the talk by Cyan Laser at the last TLX goes into all the different the design of the different enemies that are invoking different aspects of how to behave in this world. So the devouring, I think, actually is hitting a lot of the different aspects of these qualities of presence. I actually did an interview with the team as well to dive into a lot of the different aspects of their design process. But that's certainly a standout when it comes to an experience that is hitting all the different right elements. And then you have the marble puzzles by Jar. So this is just a world, again, it's like a spatialized puzzle. Again, just kind of more about the mental friction of trying to solve these different spatialized ways in which that you need to combine all the different pipes to go from level to level. And then you have the Yakuza Lounge, so I think having different aspects of the NPCs where you're seeing some interaction and dialogue. And so in terms of mental and social presence, you have to end up you get a lot of the narrative through reading these dialogue boxes. And solving these different puzzles. And so there's a kind of a puzzle adventure aspect here. And then another one by Yakuza, which this is actually a number of 4 different shots all compiled together. But so this is the Luxurian world by Yakuza. And my experience of first going into here, I feel like I'm almost bombarded by a lot of these sort of text chats, and there's a lot of reading. And so, but I think, this is the type of experience where there's not a lot of NPCs and a lot of dialogue that, in some ways, an experience like this is, to what degree do you want to have some of that from like diegetic sound and in trying to get, dialogue that's recorded? But then if you have that, then are you only limiting yourself to people who speak English and then the more language? So there's a lot of these different trade-offs that you have to make in terms of accessibility versus, the degree to which that you're in a VR experience, but you end up doing a lot of reading. And when you do a lot of reading, then it kind of can take you out of feeling like you're immersed. And so I think that's a tension that I find sometimes in some of these worlds, that if there is a lot of text, then the text can actually be detrimental to other aspects of like your embodied presence. And so can there be other ways to convey different aspects of that story? Like if you see a lot of immersive theater like Sleep No More or Then She Fell, there's no words or no talking, and it kind of creates this dreamlike quality that a lot of the information is communicated through embodied dance, and they're kind of communicating narrative through different avatars that are kind of moving their bodies around rather than communicating with dialogue. But there's still certainly a place for this type of thing. But I'm just, as I go through it, I can notice that if it goes too far in one direction, and if each person may have a temperamental preference, and if it has too much of one quality of presence, then it may be turned off for some people. All right, and then the final one for this section is the Udon Bird Sanctuary. And I put this in here because there's AI animals that are in there, and they're kind of following you around. And part of the mental and social presence is creating mental maps and models about the world and what you expect. And what makes this world so joyful is because you kind of know what these ducks or geese are going to be behaving like in real life, and they're able to kind of match it enough for you to like feel like these are animals that are kind of meeting some of your expectations for how it would kind of feel like to be on a bird sanctuary like this. But there's also this sort of novelty of doing things that are surprising to you. So this is an area where the AI and the NPCs can start to interact with, transcending your expectations. But yeah, just AI in general and NPCs, I think, is going to be a big part of that kind of mental and social presence. All right, and then the last one is the emotional presence, and this is the degree to which that your emotions are really feel engaged within the experience, but it's also all about like building and releasing tension. So there's different experiences like the Jean-Michel Jarre New Year's Eve by VR Room. This is just a world that it just, this music performance, it's totally immersive, and it's got all this projection mapping, and it's got this strong sense of environmental presence as well. but it sort of takes you on this emotional journey. Also, The Edge by Mochi is, again, just the kind of like this music experience that is really, exploring all these different aspects. They have the Club Gumball by Screaming Color. This is an experience that actually there's a lot of puzzles, but you have these payoffs with these different shader experiences, and the music and the soundtrack here I think is particularly worth pointing out because it does create this sense of really feeling like you're immersed within this world by the music that is created for it. And then this is the the Sketchu Silver Forest by Sketchu. I just felt like this was creating quite a mood with all the coloring and all the different lighting that was in here. You have the Finding Pandora X, which in terms of narratives and stories, being able to kind of have an immersive theater type of experience that has a story and narrative, and you have different choices, but it's really trying to tell a larger story through the conceits of immersive theater. Now this is the going back to the Kazahana Peak developed by Legends. A lot of the lighting in this piece I think is, whenever you have really good lighting, that lighting can really help set the mood and set an emotional tone, and also the color palettes that are happening and the contrast that you have between the different rooms. And then we have, and then the Fort. This is by Rich Ontario. This is just a place that just really has a sense of an emotional mood. It's got a lot of nostalgia as well as you go into like building these forts, and so there's a lot of ways in which these games and whatnot that you may have played as a kid, or just I don't know, there's a way that it was an experience that I felt a lot of emotion within. So as we look at, there's different ways of active presence and mental social presence and emotional presence and embodied environmental presence. Again, all of these are all happening at the same time, and there's different centers of gravity, and there's ways that you're trying to balance each of these. Okay. So now I'm going to go through the other sections here. So that was the quality of experience, the context of experience. So hopefully people see this a little bit here. So the domains of human experience, whenever I ask people about what the ultimate potential of VR is, they will answer into one of the domains. They'll say, oh, it's all about entertainment or medicine or, building your career, hanging out with friends, or, expressing your identity, having a sense of home or family. So as you go through those different contexts, another way of thinking about world building, there's Alex McDowell. He has a whole world building mandala, and if you look this up online, you can sort of dig into each of these different nuances. But the idea is that you go to all these different domains of a human experience, and that if you really want to build out a world and imagine what the future is going to be like, then you start to have some opinion as to where it is right now, and then sort of project out into the future or the past. And then start to build it out and start to have some nuances where you could go into something like, hey, this is what the medical hospital would be like. And so there's a certain process that Alex McDowell does, which he actually brings up all these different subject domain experts and gets our all input in terms of trying to figure out what these worlds are going to look like. So the world building mandala, though, is also, it's a little hard to see here, but it's also talking about like as you go into the self, and then as you have the different scopes of identity. So this kind of like blow that out a little bit more. There's a theories of moral development where you have yourself and your identity, but then you have your familial identity, community identity, other identity, and world identity, and then sort of the cosmic identity. So each of those scales of identity, as you go out, then you start to have like things about like the culture of a city. When you go to a city and you start to say, well, I live in Portland, Oregon. There's a certain amount of what it's like to be in Portland, Oregon, with the different types of things that you might see within that culture. Let's say values around like bike lanes, or vegan food, or different ways which you go to different cities. They have different aspects of that city that become a part of that identity of that city. And so as you think about world building, you're also thinking about different aspects that are unique at different scales of identity. And then this is this white text doesn't show up well here. But at the time, this is another way of looking at how there's different scales of, say, the culture, and then the culture drives the laws and the economy, and then the different user experience, and then the app, and then the actual technology. And so that's just saying that, there's going to be different laws and rules and the economic dynamics. And so any sort of world building that you're creating is going to have certain rules that you encode within the world that are going to drive certain behaviors, and there's going to be different ways of value exchange. This is a type of frame that I end up using quite a lot for looking at different ethical questions, which, ethics comes up a lot in terms of these different contexts, trying to map out all the different ethical and moral dilemmas, looking at through the lens of these different contexts, so say like privacy or, medical context, ends up being very helpful, but that also those same ethical issues is what becomes interesting in, say, something like Black Mirror, where they're sort of projecting out and saying, here's how this culture is going to continue to develop, and they're going to sort of look at it through the lens of an ethical or moral dilemma. So looking at it through the lens of ethical and moral dilemmas, I think, is actually a good and interesting way to kind of do some interesting speculative design in terms of world design. So I've done some other works on, XR ethics, and did a whole XR ethics manifesto, and, you'd be able to, look up and see all the different nuances of different ethical and moral dilemmas with each of these different contexts when it comes to XR technologies. It's, beyond the scope of this talk here, but I think it's worth pointing out that context there's this connection between the ethics and the world building process. And again, some of these different contexts have this dialectic between a public context and private context, and the context that is just yourself and the other. And so a lot of different ways in which that, let's say here in VRChat, having your own private world that you're inviting people into. And so that's a private context, and you have different culture that's, that unfolds within that context. So yeah, this is just another way of looking at each of those different contexts. And I'll just quickly go through each of those again, just as a quick example. So in terms of the identity, we have the, just different avatar representations that you have. Obviously, this is a huge part of VRChat here. You have the context of, merchandise and exchanging a value. So there's like a merchandise store in Roblox. You have early education. That's another context. And again, as I'm going through these, you can kind of think about like a sci-fi vision of like Star Trek or Star Wars. Each of them will kind of think about, what does education look like in the future? Or what does education look like in this world? And so as you're building out worlds, if you want to get really robust and thinking about worlds, then you should be thinking about some of these different contexts and what they might look like in your world. And then when you add that in, then it feels like more of a robust world that could actually exist. So then you have different ways that you're connecting to your family. Here, there's just, people talking to Zoom over their family. You have virtual concerts that are happening and entertainment. You have virtual medicine, virtual dates and going on romantic dates. So what's that look like in your world? Or is that a part of what your world is? Death and grieving, and so the virtual Dia de los Muertos experiences. You have higher education and conferences here. We're in a conference right now. You have workplace telepresence. You have hanging out with friends. And then you have combating isolation. So those are just kind of a rough tour, like a quick tour of some of each of these contexts. And there's many different other aspects of each of those contexts. But again, I'd sort of refer back to this world building mandala. Look it up online, and that'll help sort of be a catalyst to help to think about a lot of these different aspects of world building. Okay, so in terms of context, there's this world that's called Five Skies by Juice that I think actually does an interesting job of going from one context to another. So whenever you have the ability to kind of shift from world to world to world, in some sense you're kind of shifting your context. And what I don't see as much of in any of these VR experiences is a world that says, let's explore someone's identity by going in through, okay, what was their childhood like? What was their what was school like? Did they have any medical conditions? What about their romantic life? What about their parents? Or what about, their career? How are they known? How do they express their identity? So each of those different contexts could be different worlds. And if you think about, even just mashing two worlds together and how those two different contexts come together. But I think that's actually one of the strengths I recommend people going to see the experience called The Book of Distance. It's on Steam because that's an experience that, ended up winning a Webby Award and, was one of my favorite narrative experiences from 2019 or 2020. But it actually goes into these different contexts, and you really feel embodied into those different contexts. And there's a wide range of those different contexts, and it's a very powerful conceit to kind of jump from one context to another in terms of trying to tell the story. So also there's the JobsCon, which I think is coming up in like 23 days or so. I got a tour from Little Bagel. And this is just like a professional context. So if you want to get a job, so what's that? And so there's a whole world that's created about, the whole purpose of it is to find a job with, having the different people who have jobs and people who need jobs, and they're all coming together. But it's, again, a very specific context. And then you have like the South by Southwest, which was created by Vroom. This was the whole festival. So it's like a music festival, entertainment experience that also has some professional networking aspects. But this was a world that was created in VRChat that had a very specific context. You have all the virtual market and all the different worlds that happen in virtual market, which is all about these kind of exchanging of value of these different virtual assets, and kind of just like also just creating these immersive experiences that aren't necessarily always selling anything. And then you have the VRCon, which is all about communicating aspects of the community, so different communities and highlighting those communities, and so trying to create a symbolic representation of a community within a way that you could see within a booth, and then from there to kind of go into a world to experience that community directly. So that's sort of the friends and hanging out context. Here's for the last TLX conference, which, we're here now. This is sort of like the academic, context of exchanging education and ideas, and kind of like the TED Talk stage. So that's obviously by Orwell's. And then there's a number of different worlds here, all about like the hangout, generalized space. So this is the fort, and then you have the Aquarius by Orwell, Aquarius by Benz, and then you have the Nostalgia Nights, and then the Kazahana Peak. So each of these are just really trying to create this vibe of like, it's like a home. It's like someone's home that you're going into, and it's a private space that you're kind of like hanging out, and there's a lot of these worlds that have beds that people sleep in. So that is another context of like making it feel like you're inviting someone over to your home to hang out. So that's the context. The character we'll go through here. So there's a quote by Robert McKee that says, "True character is revealed in the choices a human being makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation, and the truer the choice to the character's essential nature." So in other words, when you're watching a story, you're watching someone who is under pressure, and they may have to make a choice. And the choice that they make under pressure is telling you a part of their character. They're revealing their character and the choices that they make. And that's a lot about what storytelling is. And so when you think about character, there's certain aspects of the protagonist being placed in a context under pressure. They're making choices, and they're taking some sort of action. And then there's some part of their essential character that is revealed through that process. So how do we talk about character? You can talk about it through your conscious self, your unconscious self, your ego, your shadow. You could talk about it through different aspects of moral character, through courage and temperance and generosity. And so are you building an experience that's really trying to put people in situations where they have to exhibit courage, or have sort of friendliness, or justice or wit, all these different ways that you could start to just take a character trait and try to design an entire experience over it. There's a continuum where you could have some contrast between different extremes of a certain character. Then you have different aspects of, like, this is an example from Westworld, where they have different dimensions of all these characters, and this was an animated scene where they're kind of trying to design certain personality traits by all these different character traits. You have different character temperament that you could start to use as a conceit for designing different worlds. You have the big five personality characteristics. You have different feelings and needs. A lot of when you look at storytelling, it's about someone having a certain need or desire or feeling, and trying to, from there, create situations where they're trying to achieve their needs. And at the end of the day, when you're designing worlds, then you also need to look at, okay, what are the kind of experiences you're trying to create? Are you trying to evoke a certain feeling? Are you trying to satisfy someone's need by this world that you're creating? So this can be a very helpful lens in terms of world building and design. So some examples from from different experiences. So The Devouring is an experience that I spent 5 hours with Mike Salmon and Joe Hunting, Little Poe. And there's ways in which that Little Poe is here in the audience, where Lil Poe wanted to kind of have like a whole like military strat, and like putting up his fist to say, okay, this is clear. And then I realized that I have like a lot of impatience when there's a lot of that, and I feel like there's a bit of that like Leroy Jenkins aspect where it's just like, okay, everybody's sort of like trying to like figure out all the perfect strategy. I'm just like, I'm just gonna go for it. I'm just gonna go. I don't care. So there's a part of like that happened again and again. Maybe that's a part of my essential character, where when I'm in these situations that are in kind of a playful context, that I end up acting in a certain way. And I think that's what's so interesting about, experiences like this long, but also just experiences in general, is that if you can try to create an experience that is revealing someone's character, so by the end of it, they actually learn something about themselves. And then you have Never Have I Ever. The whole conceit that you see within VRChat, where people play these games, but I think a lot of it is about revealing aspects of your character. Whether or not you've done certain activities or not could be a way of kind of revealing certain aspects of what your essential character is. It could be very context dependent, but it's also a way of kind of sharing who you are and different aspects of your personality and your character. And then the Collider was an experience that I've done where it was a lot about one person's in VR and the other person's out of VR. And this experience in particular was really exploring the character traits of boundaries and power. So there's a power asymmetry where the person who's in VR is kind of being controlled by someone who's outside of VR. And there's a lot of ways in the person's outside of VR can kind of mess with that person with like feathers and kind of tickling them, or like there's a lot of opportunities where you have to make these ethical choices to what degree you're kind of, do you know this person? Do you not know this person? Are you going to kind of play with the boundaries of the conceit of what that experience was, which is it was there to kind of have all these different objects to kind of mess with people through this power asymmetry, but they had you invoke different memories of, like, say, they had two different people going, and they had two different audio experiences. One person had to recall a memory that they had where they had someone else have power over them, and then the other person had to recall a memory from their own personal life where you had undue power over them. So it was the opposite if I messed that up. So you have people who have power over and you have power under. And then as you do that, you're kind of painting over those memories and trying to have this psychographic interaction with two different people, and then have this different interaction. And at the end of it, have an ability to kind of unpack and talk about it. But this is an example of an experience where it's really talking about different aspects of those character traits. All right, the last one is the story. The story is, the kind of hero's journey where there's a beginning, middle, and end. There's like a mundane space. You kind of cross over the threshold. You go through some sort of ordeal. And then once you go through that, then you kind of bring back information back to, kind of the hero's return, where you're sharing the knowledge that you gained. But in a lot of ways, that's, you're developing different aspects of your character as you go through this story. But in the story, there's different modes and models of trying to break up stories in different aspects. There's Dan Harmon's story circle. There's Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. There's Alex McDowell has this whole brief history of storytelling where, storytelling in the old days, the myths, they were never written down. They were always kind of delivered as oral history, and it was a collaborative process where people would sort of add in and they would add music. And then eventually, once sort of the media came in, there was a sort of a linearization where it was canonized within different communication media. We're kind of getting away from that linearized canonization and back into this sort of more collaborative, participatory storytelling where it's about, co-creating and participating in the story rather than just being told what the story is. So that's I think is an interesting way of kind of thinking about we're returning to old ways of storytelling with these immersive media. Story authorship is on one end, there's the authored narrative, and the other end, there's the generative narrative. And so this is, sort of the interactive gaming where in some ways, on one end, you have the authored narrative where whatever you do is not going to change the story at all. So there's no way for you to do anything to change how the story unfolds. And the other is, like, it becomes more of an expression of your will and your agency. And at that point, it becomes more of a video game and an open world exploration. But there's this tension because on one end, building and telling a story is all about building and releasing tension that is authored, where the more that the author has control over how that plays out, the more of a strong story can be. But yet once you add agency in there, then it becomes more about you, expressing your will. So there's this tension here between authored narrative and generative narrative that I think is like this existential tension that I think you see in all interactive media. Is how do you do that? Do you do context switch? Do you do cutscenes? Do you sort of have like Alex and other ways in which that the story's unfolding and you can kind of still, but essentially this is a tricky problem. But when you think about whose character is revealed, well, in the authored narrative, you're not doing anything. And so it's more about the people who are featured in the story. You're learning about their character. But in a generative narrative, you have the potential to be able to be put into situations where you are revealing your character. So the generative narrative has the possibility for you to go through experience, and by the end of it, you learn something about yourself, about your true essential nature and your true essential character. Now, that's really hard to do in a half hour or 15 minutes or an hour, but I think it's possible. Like I said, like the devouring, that was an interactive experience where maybe I learned something about my own true essential character. Even though it was a contrived experience, it was still enough of experience that there could be something that was kind of tapping into my character. And that's always the question. Is this aspect of my personality context dependent to this experience, or is it something that transcends this experience and goes into all experiences? And I think that's sort of the journey that we're all going to face with going through these different immersive worlds, is that we'll find out if there may be certain aspects that are kind of consistent through whatever experience we're in. We're going to see certain aspects of our character. Now, this goes into different nuances of like whether you're a ghost or have a character, or whether you're a ghost or where you're embodied as a character, or whether or not you have agency or not. This gets into a lot of the narrative aspects. And I'll go through this quickly, which is Lebowitz and Klug's interactive storytelling spectrum. And so there's different ways that you go through the different spectrums. So on the far end, you have the 3-act structure. This is, again, you have no agency. When you start to add a little bit of agency, then you start to have like these branchings where it sort of will come out, and then it'll collide again. And sometimes you'll have multiple endings or one ending. But at the end of it, this is sort of like the agency is you're flavoring the experience. You're not actually changing too much of how the story unfolds. And so you're having like maybe audience participation rather than true interactivity. And then in the middle, you have the branching path stories where whatever choice you make actually sort of spins out into a whole another narrative, which takes a lot of ability to try to like write what all those narratives are, but also it's sort of diminishing returns in terms of how much work you have to do versus what people actually experience when they go through it. So, I mean, this is a lot of work, and, some people do it, and you don't see it a lot because it is exponential in terms of the more choices that you give, the more work you have to do with how that goes out. And it ends up mostly converging without having too much of an exponential dimension there. And then there's interactive drama managers, something like Facade, where you have some agency, but it's paying attention to what you're doing, and then based upon what you're doing, then you have the ability to kind of dynamically dictate what the story and how it is unfolded. So you can still have this ability to feel like you're really participating, but it's sort of dynamically changing the story as you're interacting with it. The open-ended stories is, different object-oriented ways that you're just trying to make it so each of the different objects have different interactivity aspects. But again, you start to get into less of a story and more of an open world. And then eventually you're going to get into like the fully player-driven stories, which again are more about these open worlds.
The Half-Life kind, not the kind.
I hear someone speaking over there.
Sorry. I was...
So then, so again, that's sort of a spectrum of interactive storytelling. And then I think the big point is like whose character is revealed. So just to make quick examples, you have Love Seat, which is an immersive theater piece that, have these different aspects of, this particular piece, there's a branching point where you actually go off into two different areas. There's a group, and so there's a dimension of like group facilitation and dynamics that are happening. There's a story that's being told as you go through that is pretty consistent anytime that you see it. Then there's something like Scarecrow, where there's an immersive theater component, very embodied interaction. I actually saw this at Sundance in 2019. And then there was it was translated into VRChat for Raindance later in the year. And when I saw it at Sundance, it was actually a one-on-one interaction, which I think is a lot more powerful to be able to have a one-on-one interaction where you have a lot more ability to have a story that kind of emerges out of whatever your personal interactions are versus what the version that was at VRChat, which had a lot more people. And then the Welcome to Respite, I had a sneak preview of this, but it's an experience that is going to be premiering at Tribeca. And this is an experience that it's actually an adaptation of an immersive theater piece. I'd say it's one of those areas that is really kind of exploring different aspects of a specific story, looking at dissociative identity disorder. All right. I think I'm going to go through this really quick because I just want to leave some time for questions. So fusing together design disciplines. Again, we talked about like the video game design and human-computer interaction and cinematic storytelling and architecture and embodiment and theater. Each of these are distinctly different design disciplines that at this point, like immersive technologies are kind of fusing all these together. And because they have all these different design philosophies, then how do you fuse them together? I think that's a challenge that everybody that is working in the space has to kind of figure out their own way of how to take the insights from each of these different domains and feed them together in what you're creating in your world. Now, there's two things I want to say. One is that the architecture in the film is so much more about this waterfall process, where there's a kind of a linear process where there's a pre-production, production, and post-production, and you're done, right? You make the film, and then you make the building, and then you basically ship it, and it doesn't change after that. I think with game design and with web design, you have much more agile, iterative processes where there's a lot more testing, where there's a human in the loop of that equation, and humans, because they're hard to mathematically model, you have to actually build it and have people see it and see what they react to it, because it's hard to predict. Even though you may have an experience, you have to calibrate your own game design intuition by how other people are reacting to these things. So, but this whole waterfall versus agile, these are two completely different processes, and there's ways in which they're in tension with each other, because in one sense, like a film and a story, you want to have everything planned out and mapped out, and then you do it. And you don't want to be like iterating when you're on a film, and it just exponentially increases the amount of the cost, both in a film or a building that you're building. So I think this is, again, a challenge of trying to figure out how to balance these two together. Again, there's a linear film production process. Alex McDowell has a whole visualization of looking at all these different phases. But when you look at something like architecture, again, it's like this very linear process. You can see each of these slides are like, from one step to the next, it's basically linear. And then when you get to the game design, you can see it's much more this iterative approach. And so I think if there's any one thing that I see is like there's a lot of the software design practices that are going into design for web design and game design, but those game design principles are being designed for all of experiential design. And so it's moving into these loops where you got to do a lot of user testing, get it in front of a lot of people, and to get that feedback from people to really help drive your process. There's lots of different lenses, different design processes. I think the one that I really want to, there's an empathy map that sort of says, all these different aspects of what do they see, what do they hear, what are they thinking, what actions are they taking, which I think, goes into all the different aspects of active presence, mental and social presence, embodied presence, emotional presence. There's these lenses where you try to imagine people, and the empathy map is all about trying to put yourself into the user's experience and then trying to figure out how to sort of cultivate an experience to be able to modulate their experience. There's the empathy field guide, which you could, like Robin Hunicke is somebody who said that, she really starts with the feeling and the emotion. She wants to start with that feeling, and from that feeling, she wants to design a whole world that is designed around trying to cultivate that specific feeling. There could be a feeling or a need you could start to design worlds around. The Aristotle has the four causes: the final cause, formal cause, material cause, and efficient cause. For me, the most important in terms of design is the purpose. Like, what is your purpose? What is your intention? What do you want to communicate? What do you want people to experience? And it's from that intention and purpose that drives everything else that you're doing. And I think there's a number of different lenses here that I've been trying to go through in terms of these different intentions. Whether it's the quality of the experience, the context of the experience, the character of the experience, or the experience, the story of the experience. Each of these are different lenses that, as you're designing the world, you can start to focus on. Okay, what am I trying to do here? What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to cultivate this feeling or cultivate this expression of this aspect of the character, or trying to tell this specific part of the story? So again, these are all different ways that, as I've been, going through all these thousands of different experiences and done over, 1,600 different interviews with creators, these are the different aspects that come up again and again in these conversations of different trade-offs that these creators have been able to do. So again, the 4 dimensions of experience, at least the lenses that I use, again, there could be many other lenses, but I think these are ways that at least are intuitive for me to understand the quality, context, character, and story. And then, all of this is about, fusing these different design disciplines. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Woo. So, Kent, where can we sign up for the full college seminar of this talk? I think it should probably only be like, 3-4 months, full semester.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions,
prefabs,
please, there is a voice on there, so you're welcome.
Yeah, the question Fiona was, where can they sign up for the full college level class? So this was like a 45-minute version of the talk. I've done 2-hour versions of the talk that are on YouTube. Oh. But I think the real this version in the talk, I went through a lot of VRChat worlds and tried to like start to interpret different VRChat worlds through that lens. I think, the challenge with a lot of this experiential design framework was that it's been developed by watching a lot of experiences at these film festivals that just aren't generally available. And so, with VRChat, these experiences are generally available. So there's a part of the process that I'm going through, which is, going through these different worlds and starting to do different translations. And so what that means, I go through and create more embodied experiences, but I think it'd be fun to be able to have a course where it's like, okay, go have this experience, go have this experience, go have this experience, from Steam or in VRChat or wherever. And then we'll come together and kind of break apart. Because I think a big part of this process is having a common baseline. Just like when people are watching films, they start talking about, oh, this film or this film. And the name of the film becomes a shortcut from a specific aspect of either a story or an experience. And I think just the same, I could say, well, Beat Saber, they do this. Or in Among Us, they have this sort of experience. And but also being able to kind of break down different aspects of that experience and all the different subtle nuances based upon your own direct experience, but also through all these different lenses. So,
sort of
but yeah, if there's interest in that. Oh, yeah.
we need a VRChat World Book Club. That actually sounds like a fantastic idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but let's see if there's other questions.
You have a question? No, go ahead of me. It's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Since you've got to experience a lot of content inside of VRChat and outside of VRChat, would you say that there are some things that world creators in VRChat do extremely well and something that they don't do enough compared to other experiences?
Well, I think relative to all the other social VR, if there's one type of presence that VRChat accelerates in, it's in the embodied and environmental presence. The fact that you can build all the worlds, the fact you have so many different avatar representations. Like something like Rec Room is very strong in, say, active presence. It's all about the games and interactions, and they have even ability for people to create their own games, right? The Wave XR was really great with emotional presence. Something like Big Screen VR. Or AltSpace VR, I'd say accelerates in social presence in the sense that, to go have like a professional gathering, AltSpace is, they have a meritocracy of different avatar representation. So it's less about expressing your own identity. It's more about having everybody on the same page so they can just sort of connect to each other in a professional context. Or Big Screen VR, there's not a lot of locomotion around, and so you're not moving, so that ends up being a little bit more intimate for a social VR interactions. So if anything that VRChat is doing well, it's in the embodied presence and environmental presence. But the thing that I think has not been there as much is the emotional presence in terms of the storytelling. I don't see as much storytelling here in terms of there's a lot more experimentation that's happening at the film festivals, but a lot of people in this room have figured out how to kind of navigate the nuances of Udon and VRChat SDK, all the things that you have to do. It's a high bar for people who are storytellers to kind of learn all of that, to be able to use all of the tools here. And then you still may even be hampered by not having the full access to say what you could do in Unity. So for most people, they just decide to do it in Unity and not even bother. So I think because of that, you don't tend to see as much strong storytelling type of experiences. But I think if anything, that's like the room for the most growth for VRChat as a platform to kind of explore more of that. And I think you're starting to see that more with the immersive theater, because you can kind of do a stopgap with the limitations of having to learn all the SDK by just having a lot of live theater actors that are able to give you that narrative experience.
To go off of your response, would you say that emotional presence is the most difficult one to achieve because it requires so much?
Well, I mean, there's emotional presence. A lot of the emotional presence that I see are a lot of the music based, and so the edge and the different experiences that are really focused on the music and building and releasing that tension. I think it's probably the hardest because there's that tension between, to tell a good story means that you have to be passively receiving. In the medium of VR, you want to be active, right? So it's this tension of how do you incorporate someone's agency and interactivity so it's meaningfully integrated into a story that you're trying to tell. And, this is like an existential tension that is hard for even it's like an open problem for the entire world to try to fuse those two things of agency with story. Because, Eric Darnell told me, cause he's done a lot of different animations, and those stories were all about you want to control the building and releasing of that tension and have tight control over every shot, right? And so there's this, cinematic filmmaking where you want to be like a control freak over every aspect of what you're seeing and hearing. But VR, you have to let go of a lot of that control, and you have to like put over the agency over to wherever the person wants to look, but in order to make it feel immersive in your sense of active presence, you need to have interactions that feel like you have agency, but you can also see a trace of your agency throughout the course of the narrative. Otherwise, it feels like you're just kind of selecting colors and it's not really having much impact. And then you don't feel like you have much buy-in in terms of there's nothing at stake for any choice that you're making. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that it's just a hard problem. But I'd say the biggest thing is that, the technical skills you have to do to be able to produce any content within VRChat.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we saw in 2014 you start to do that Voice of VR podcast, but you went from a real public in real life to COVID in front of a screen and in VR. So can you describe that transition from real public to virtuality with a headset for those type of presentation?
So whenever I probably went to 60 to 70 different conferences from 2014 to 2019, the beginning of 2020, and after that I've had to do everything virtual. And so the hardest thing to do at a virtual conference is having the hallway conversations. And whenever I would go to a conference, I would just be in the hallway talking to people. And like I said, I've done like 1,600 interviews, and most of that were going to a conference and then not going to any sessions and just talking to people. So that's a big difference. But another difference of just presenting is that, this is probably the closest that I felt in terms of, having people in a room and Altspace. I've done some talks in Altspace, but, in terms of like feeling really like the environmental design of the space just feels really nice. I think ORails did an amazing job of really creating this sense of like really feeling like you're in an auditorium. And just having everybody who's in VRChat, like most people in Altspace, they don't spend like 6 hours in a headset, but people here in VRChat, they spend like 6 hours in a headset all the time, right? So like the biggest challenge of a virtual conference is getting people to commit to be in a VR headset for that long to get the benefits of being co-present in a place where there's a shared context that's being cultivated and developed. And you have this sort of ability to kind of chat with people in the hallways based upon what you just saw. And the biggest challenge is that when people go to virtual conferences, they don't commit in the same way that they do when they actually go. But I think in VRChat and in this world in particular, in this gathering, it's the closest that I've seen in terms of replicating the conference experience because of both the amazing world design and all the people, but also the people that are here that are fully committed to being here.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, I've got a question regarding, so in comparison to like games within VRChat versus like, single player immersive experiences outside of VRChat, like a game you buy on Steam, like Resident Evil or something like that, you've got these characters that like you're playing. Like when you get into the game, you are now Leon Kennedy, you're playing his story. Versus when you are in VRChat, you're kind of embodying your own custom avatar. How do you suggest when thinking about emotional like impact from a world? How do you suggest creators go about putting you into a story that maybe isn't really yours? Like for example, if you're playing it like a VR game on Steam, you're maybe playing as like a specific character. So I'm just curious, like how do you kind of combat that, like this isn't really your story, you are embodying a character in VR kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a hard problem because you're right. When you embody, imagine just getting thrown into the world and all of a sudden you're embodying a character, but you don't know who you are and what the context is and what character traits you have. And if probably Half-Life Alyx does this to a really good extent, where you're playing a very specific character of Alyx, but you don't have. It works the most well whenever there's an alignment between whatever Alyx is saying and what you're feeling at the same time, right? So there's resonance, but there's a lot of time where there's a dissonance between what she's saying and what you're feeling. So then it can actually break your sense of embodied presence because there's not an alignment between what is being said and what. And so you can think of it as like you have a suspension of disbelief whenever you go and see a movie, and then you see like a plot gap in the movie, and then your sense of mental plausibility collapses. So it's like a house of cards that collapses, right? So the sense of presence, and I'd say this is probably around the mental presence, where the plausibility of whatever's happening, whenever it deviates, it sort of collapses, and it ruins your sense of presence when that happens. And whenever you're embodying a character, it's really difficult to do that because it happens all the time. There's so many varieties of different people and character, it's impossible unless you have biometrics that are sort of really measuring all that stuff. So one of the approaches that I've seen that works particularly well is what Eric Darnell and Baobab Studios have done, which is you're not the main protagonist, but you're a sidekick, right? So there's other people that are maybe having the most of the direction and the character, and you're kind of there along for the ride. You're not the one that's sort of in the front seat, but you're kind of in a side seat. But it allows the ability to have other characters that are there to help sort of direct how that narrative is unfolding without putting so much pressure on you to kind of become the protagonist. So yeah, I mean, the other thing is that there's an experience that is it's an immersive theater piece that it's I'm trying to remember it's called the Meta Movie Project, where you're a protagonist and there's you do improv acting with 3 other actors. But there's a lot of other audience members that are flybots that are flying around. So, but it's essentially an immersive theater piece that has 3 actors for you as an individual, and you are a character, and you have the ability to become yourself. And so, the most that you could allow a person to be themselves is to have other people that are responding to you and reflecting to you your identity, but actually having human beings there, because AI is not good enough to be able to do that yet. To be able to understand what you're saying and then kind of sort of reinforce different stuff. So I think right now what I'm seeing at least is that a lot of the sort of challenges of that are happening within the context of immersive theater, where you're solving a lot of that problem with human labor and having other people that are doing a lot of that stuff. But in terms of narrative design, I mean, that's a broader issue, and that's probably a big reason why you don't see a lot of VR experiences that are like that, because there are so many issues that come up in trying to achieve that. But you see that a lot more in, say, experiments on the film festival circuit that are playing with that a little bit more.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome.